Many nonprofits have a huge local grassroots impact, but some nonprofits tackle issues from a global scale. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about the global impact of nonprofit agencies, and we're also going to discuss the diversity issues that tend to run rampant in nonprofit organizations and address specific strategies that nonprofit leaders can deploy in their agencies to ensure that their organizations are diverse, equitable, and inclusive. When serving their communities, another way that nonprofits should be mindful of doing that and doing it in a way that's impactful and equitable is by ensuring that they're emphasizing global impact and diversity. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand what NGOs and IGOs are, how we classify NGOs, what are some of the major issues that international nonprofits face from a global perspective, and we'll also examine diversity problems in the nonprofit workforce. We'll also talk about specific things like board diversity, distinguish between DE&I, and explain how these diversity, equity, and inclusion programs can be applied to nonprofits. First, let's talk about global impact and define the roles that NGOs and IGOs play in the nonprofit sector, and also describe what they are. According to the UN, or the United Nations, a non-governmental organization, or an NGO, is a nonprofit that is a voluntary citizens group that is organized on a local, national, or international level. And it's intended to address issues in support of the public good. So many nonprofits meet the definition of being also an NGO, but not all nonprofits meet this classification. NGOs engage in political advocacy on issues related to foreign policy, elections, the environment, healthcare, human rights, and others. In fact, there are a lot of different classifications of NGOs, which we'll cover in a moment. If you look at the number of NGOs worldwide, the data are unfortunately incomplete. So it's really hard to estimate how many exist. However, some estimates suggest that there are more than 10 million nonprofits or NGO nonprofits worldwide. NGOs often partner and work in collaboration with IGOs as they seek out to tackle really broad global issues. An IGO is an intergovernmental organization, and this refers to an entity created by a government treaty, and it usually involves two or more nations with the pact to work in good faith around issues of common interest. So the United Nations is one example that's comprised of many different countries that work together as an IGO in partnership with NGOs. The European Union is comprised of multiple European nations, and the World Trade Organization has many nation members across the world. So all of these NGOs have some specific headquarters, but the work that they do fits within the definition of an NGO because their work is global in scale and sometimes massive in scale. Save the Children, for example, has a global reach of 120 countries. Now that you know about NGOs and how they seek to solve global problems, let's talk about some of those global issues that international nonprofits and NGOs address. Across the world, no matter where you live, there are shared concerns. This can include things like reducing poverty, improving education, improving healthcare and health outcomes, human rights, environmental conservation, and global hunger. Healthcare is a widespread topic that NGOs seek to address, and this can apply to any health-related global issue. This can include things like global vaccination campaigns or disease prevention, HIV and AIDS prevention, maternal and health childcare, or mental health resources. Another common issue that many NGOs address are related to human rights, to ensure that people have protected civil liberties, like a freedom of speech, they have equal rights, that they are able to live a life free of discrimination and violence. And in particular, human rights NGOs often seek to support marginalized or vulnerable groups. Environmental conservation is about protecting our natural resources, fighting climate change, promoting renewable energy, reducing waste, and advocating for sustainable practices on a global scale. And eradicating world hunger. This is the objective of many different NGOs, including Feed the Children, which aim to ensure food security by providing aid, ensuring there are sustainable pipelines and sustainable agriculture practices, and addressing supply chain issues in our food supply. And there are some other issues that NGOs seek to address. These are just the most common, but some other issues that don't necessarily fit within these categories neatly are around things like building peace, disaster relief that obviously isn't predictable, animal welfare, child welfare, and others. Given the large number of NGOs worldwide, again, some estimates put that at around 10 million, and the variety of the work they do, although we know that there are 5 general issues that NGOs seek to address, let's talk about the predominant classification system that is used for NGOs worldwide. ICNPO stands for the International Classification of Nonprofit Organizations. And this is just one framework that seems to be the most widely used, although there is no one gold standard, but this is the most generally used, that is established to classify nonprofit organizations worldwide on the basis of their primary activities and purposes. And we've talked about classifications of nonprofits in the United States relative to IRS classification and tax treatment, but this is related to nonprofits globally because nonprofits play an important role in global affairs by bridging those gaps that are left by the governments. Our governments don't do a good job, especially in certain countries, of making sure that all of the human needs are met. So NGOs, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, then are left to kind of fill that gap and provide that support where the government lacks doing that. The ICNPO groups nonprofits into 12 groups. And you'll see here a lot of these things that we discussed are those common issues that NGOs or nonprofits seek to address. Things like education, health, human services, but also other common categories as well. And they even have a catch-all group, Group 12, which is not elsewhere classified. So if you work for a nonprofit agency or you're doing an agency analysis and your agency is global in scale and seeks to address global issues, take a moment and consider which group that might fall within. Next, let's talk about some of the diversity problems that exist in the nonprofit workforce. Many people assume, and most people expect, that nonprofits set the standard when it comes to ensuring equity and diversity in their organizations. But the hard reality is this is not always the case. But first, let's talk about why this matters. Ensuring that people have equal opportunities, well, it's the right thing to do. We don't want anyone to face discrimination or to not have the same opportunities as someone else based upon certain characteristics. And there's also a business case that can be made using academic research that tells us definitively that diversity creates positive outcomes in organizations. Things like improved information sharing and decision making, innovation, avoidance of groupthink, improved organizational performance, constructive conflict that we talked about in a previous lesson, and all kinds of other positive outcomes. In recent years, many nonprofits have started to put more of an emphasis on diversity and on DE&I programs of realizing if anyone should be focusing on this and doing a good job with it, it's us. How can we be an agency that seeks to make the world a better place if we are engaging in practices and activities that don't create a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce? That would be pretty hypocritical, right? So let's talk a little bit about DE&I and the distinctions between diversity, equity, and inclusion. DE&I simply refers to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are three closely linked values. They're different, but they're inextricably linked. When it refers to organizations comprised of different individuals. In nonprofits, you've got a lot of staff and volunteers, and you're going to have people that are different races, ethnicities, religions, genders, abilities, sexual orientation, and lots of other dimensions of diversity. When we talk about diversity specifically, this is about recognizing and appreciating those differences and variances in our human characteristics among individuals. We've all had different backgrounds and upbringings. We've all had different perspectives and experiences. And sometimes these things are shaped by our characteristics. So diversity is a reflection of who is represented in the workforce. The data tell us from academic research that racial minorities are vastly underrepresented in those leadership roles. So nonprofit organizations need to expand their DE&I initiatives to not just talk the talk, but to walk the walk and proactively address this leadership gap. When it comes to gender diversity, women also tend to be well represented in nonprofits. In fact, women comprise the majority of the nonprofit workforce, about 60%. And women fill leadership positions at the executive director or CEO position, also at a high rate, about 62%. However, where nonprofits tend to fail in gender diversity is when it comes to wages. While women are well represented in the workforce and in leadership roles, unfortunately, the average salary of a female leader is just 84% of an average male. Additionally, research on equity in nonprofits tell us that women in leadership positions in nonprofits continue to face challenges like implicit biases, stereotypes, less influence, and less authority. And what's really unfortunate is when you look at that intersectionality of race and gender, because this produces even worse outcomes in the sector. We know from research that nonprofits that are headed by a Black woman, these agencies receive notably less funding to agencies led by white individuals or Black men. So these disparities, they put nonprofits at risk because gender equity in leadership is closely associated with positive image and positive performance and all the positive outcomes of diversity that we previously discussed. Another issue related to diversity is implicit bias. So this is a form of bias that happens automatically and unintentionally, But it's still a very negative thing because it affects outcomes, judgments, decisions, and behaviors. And ways that implicit bias can rear its ugly head in the nonprofit sector is when it comes to hiring. Hiring managers, even the most well-intended ones who truly think that they are very equitable minded, they tend to hire people with whom they share similarities. And that can lead to a diversity problem. And if you have a board that's not diverse, they're generally going to be making decisions on that nonprofit staff leadership of people who look like them and are like them. And that tends to be not diverse. So we know because of that if we have a diverse board of directors, that can influence a diverse staff leadership. Diversity goes beyond, of course, just race and gender, but these are the two that are most commonly studied. When we look at diversity, we identify identity groups. And identity groups refer to just those social categories or communities of people who share characteristics, experiences, or identities. So it can be race or gender, but also sexual orientation, age, religion, disability, national origin, immigration status, and a whole host of other things. So it's important to look at these identity groups and understand the diverse experiences and perspectives of individuals within society and in organizations, and to really critically look at your nonprofit base of staff, board, leadership, and volunteers, and ask yourself, do you have a diverse array of identity groups? Is it representative of the population in your community? Now, we know nonprofits have some work to do when it comes to workforce equity, but they also face some challenges around board diversity. When you look at diversity in terms of gender, nonprofit boards in the United States tend to be relatively balanced. But unfortunately, that diversity doesn't extend to race. Most nonprofit boards in the United States are predominantly white. Now, there has been an improvement in this. If you look at some recent studies, there's a study from 2019 that saw a 6% increase in people of color from the last time it was studied in 2017. So there is some progress being made in improving board diversity on the racial identity group dimension in the United States when it comes to nonprofit boards. And there are some benefits to having a diverse board. As we know, agencies with diverse boards tend to have a more diverse and equitable workforce. There's also greater opportunity for transformational change and success. It helps us avoid blind spots. It helps us make decisions that reflect the diversity of the communities that we serve, and it helps us think more critically and innovatively. Now that we've talked about diversity, let's distinguish between diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because even though programs are often lumped together as DEI programs or DE&I programs, these are different things. They're interrelated, but they are distinct. As we previously discussed, diversity refers to who is represented in the workforce. But it doesn't matter if you have an extremely diverse group of people if the people in that group are not treated equitably and they're not included. So it's important to look at the E&I element of DE&I as well. Equity centers on addressing differences and disparities and ensuring fairness across the way every person in that organization is treated. Inclusion refers to creating environments where all individuals, regardless of their identity group, feels valued and included. So they're not only treated equitably, but they're included holistically. Their opinion matters. Their voice is heard just as well as everybody else, and that they are valued equally as a member of that organization, and they are treated like a valuable member. So these are three distinct yet interconnected concepts, and nonprofit leaders have to think about these and simultaneously recognize the importance of all three of these, because having a diverse workforce, it's useless if those employees don't have equal opportunities, they don't have equal pay, and they're not valued, included, and heard. So knowing the importance of DE&I and the positive outcomes that we know that organizations benefit from when they have effective DE&I, and knowing that nonprofits don't always do a great job with these things, let's talk about what DEI programs are and how we can apply them in our nonprofits. According to a recent study, 74% of respondents working in nonprofits indicated that their agency engaged in DE&I initiatives. So on the face of it, that sounds like a really positive thing when you've got 3 out of every 4 agencies, roughly, engaging in DE&I programs. But the problem here and the failure here is when these programs don't translate into results and action. It's one thing to implement a required training in your nonprofit agency and make every employee and volunteer go online and do a 20-minute online training about DE&I and check a box and say, well, we did our DE&I program, we're good. That's not effective if it doesn't translate to actual results. We need to change on-the-job behavior that influences DE&I. And as leaders, we need to ensure that we're putting DE&I into practice. We're not just doing trainings. One way that we can prove that we're serious about DE&I is putting forth a diversity statement. This is a formal expression that outlines that organization's commitment to DE&I. It also specifically explains the actions and the principles that they're going to do to walk the walk, to back up the talk, to achieve those goals. In diversity statements, these need to go above and beyond basic HR protocols. It needs to be a combination of policy, practice, and process that drives meaningful engagement of DE&I. Some organizations have even established DE&I programs where they have a dedicated program to promote diversity among their workforce. I've seen many nonprofits establish DE&I committees comprised of a diverse representative group of volunteer, board, and staff labor, and they're meant to assess and address opportunities in that agency where they can ensure that they are being equitable, and if they're not, that they're closing that gap, that they're always in every effort and everything that they're doing ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that goes for not just program and service delivery, all the events that they host, who serves on their board, the employees that work at the organization, and the volunteer base as well. So nonprofits, they can have a huge impact in making the world a better place from a global perspective, not just local communities. But in doing so, they need to ensure that they're enacting the practices that they purport to follow in terms of making the world a better place. Nonprofit leaders should be enacting measures to ensure that their agencies are diverse, but also that they're equitable and inclusive. Only once we achieve that can we truly make the world a better place.